So you'll remember in chapter 5, Jesus came to Jerusalem, and for the Passover being near, or that's in chapter 6. In chapter 5, he came for a feast that is undisclosed, and he performed a miracle and then made himself equal with God, which made them want to kill him. In chapter 6, he goes back to Galilee, and we saw how he even begins to be rejected in Galilee, where he's mostly been received up to this point. Chapter 7, the Feast of Tabernacles brought him back to Jerusalem. And you remember he knows how hostile the environment is, how they're actively seeking to kill him. The conspiracy has begun in a more official sense. And so he goes after the feast starts. But in the middle of the feast, he's teaching in the temple, and I think that we need to continue to be impressed by the fact that even in a hostile environment among his enemies, Jesus constantly offers salvation, deliverance from sin, the way to heaven. But of course that goes through him and belief that he is the Son of God. And in chapter 7, he alluded to some Old Testament imagery where he spoke about him again, like he did in chapter 4, having the water of life, and that you should come to him who thirsts and drink, and out of his heart will flow living water. And after that, they sought to kill him. They actually made plans, and the officers, you remember, did not go to him like they were instructed, and the reason was given, no man ever spoke like this man. And we see that in chapter 7 and verse 46. So chapter 8, he's still in Jerusalem. And you see the hostility again with the interaction with these Pharisees who try to accuse this woman caught in adultery and find her guilty. Of course, they have ulterior motives in their heart. They're liars. They're dishonest. They're most likely just objectively false witnesses, though there's no suggestion that the woman was innocent. But the procedure was wrong. The motive was wrong. No compassion. Jesus pointed that out and showed his love for mankind, even those who have been caught up in sin like this woman, and told her to go sin no more. And verse 12 is where the earliest manuscripts pick up. We talked about that a little bit, but he calls himself the light of the world. And you'll remember in chapter 1 of John, in the prologue, that's how he's discussed, not just as the Word, but probably more consistently throughout the rest of John's Gospel, he is referred to as light. And of course, that's in a spiritual sense. And so when he says, the one who follows him shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life, he is offering spiritual life. But just like John 1 and verse 5 says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men, you get that life through the light of God's Word and following it. And so that continues to escalate through this chapter. The witnesses he brought up in chapter 5 to verify his claim of being equal with God is something that is directly alluded to in chapter 8. We talked about that some when they said your witness is not true. And he talked about how he bears witness of himself, but his Father bears witness too. And he enumerated some ways in which God did that in chapter 5 with the miracles, even with John the Baptist, with the Scripture, so on and so forth. There's plenty of testimony that shows Jesus' claims are all true. Chapter 7, I know we're going all over the place, but you'll remember what we've covered because it's kind of coming to a head here in chapter 8, and then as we progress through to the end of his ministry in chapter 12. In chapter 7, he had pointed out, if you really wanted to do God's will, you would know about my doctrine, whether it is from God or whether I speak on my own authority. And so if their desire is to really know Jehovah and to really follow his will, then they would see that Jesus' will is the exact same, that all of his teaching, all of his actions, they are not manifesting a deceiver or a sinner or a Sabbath breaker, but one who God sent. And he alludes to that several times in this chapter as well. And especially we'll see that at the end of this section. And it all has to do with the truth. And so I think practically what we should be observing in this chapter, especially in this second half, I'm sure that as you studied it and read it, there were some things that sounded familiar to you in a practical sense of your daily life, and how you've probably had studies and conversations with people in the world, and you've shown them the truth and shown them the truth, and they've claimed to want the truth, but at the end of the day they reject it even though it's so clear. Why do they reject it? Why do they do that? Well, we don't judge their hearts like God can, but we also can observe the fruit and see that if they really loved God, if they really wanted to follow Him fully, be faithful to Him, then they would accept this. And so they have shown themselves to be not the good soil, but the wayside soil, or just some other soil that maybe starts to receive it and then doesn't, continuing on. And that's really what we're going to see here. People want to talk about a relationship with Jesus. They want to talk about having faith in Him. We're saved by faith alone. But if we're honest with this text, Jesus Himself, and I know all the New Testament is the words of Christ, but if you want to go by Red Letters edition, then Jesus Himself is saying that is absolutely not true. It couldn't be further from the truth. It's more than just belief or faith. It's more than just a claim. It's more than just knowledge of God's Word. It's more than pedigree. It's more than history. It's more than tradition. It is about fidelity to the Word of Christ. And that relationship is molded by whether or not we're following His will. So any comments, questions up to this point? Yes, sir.
Well, seek and ye shall find. Seek is me searching out.
Right.
And trying to find it. Now I may ask you to help me, but you just telling me and me shaking my head yes doesn't particularly mean I'm seeking. And just because I've met you, because, you know what I mean, you've got to be seeking out. It's an effort.
Right, absolutely. And it's only something you can do, like you said. And it's more than intellectual. It's more than just an audible hearing, but it's an actual hearing. It's a digesting, and not just the digesting in regard to I comprehend it, but I believe it in the sense of being committed to it. That's an excellent point. And so there's more at work in our attempts to convert others than what we can just see on the surface, and we always need to realize that and not get discouraged when it doesn't work out. But also reflect on it ourselves. Am I really seeking truth? Do I really love God? And that's always tested when we come up against the truth. And so it says in verse 28 that Jesus said to them, "When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am He, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father taught me, I speak these things. And He who sent me is with me. The Father has not left me alone, for I always do those things that please Him." As He spoke these words, many believed in Him. And so before even getting to the proof that Jesus alludes to would be the final and most powerful proof of Him being lifted up on the cross. And you can't talk about Him being lifted up on the cross without Him being lifted up to heaven. Without His resurrection and ascension, then the cross is meaningless. And so it all comes to a head there, and then you'll know for sure that I am He. But of course, that doesn't mean that people won't still be hardened and reject Him. But on top of that, He says that, listen, I've never been speaking on my own. There's always been the testimony of the Scripture that I don't contradict, but that verifies what I'm saying. There's always been the Father. He's not left me alone. How would they know the Father's presence in Jesus' ministry? Miracles. How could we tell that the Father has not left you alone? Well, He's performed miracles. They know that. And it's interesting that they haven't disputed the miracles, have they? They've just nitpicked in the occasions on which those miracles were performed. And so on top of that, there's this moral power of Jesus in that He says, I always do those things that please Him. How many times have they sought to trip Him up, and He always passed the test and actually convicted them of sin in the process? How many times have they been looking in great detail with Jesus, putting Him under a magnifying glass, painting a target on His back, and they failed to see something that he's doing wrong. And they know this. And so for me, that's why that says that they believed in him. Oh, I'll finally feel backed into a corner. There's really no way around his argumentation. And so what did they believe about him? To what level, to what detail, I don't know. But at the very least, they're starting to be convinced or convicted in some way, to some degree, in some measure, that his claims aren't empty, that there's something to them. He's not a fraud like we want him to be. There's something there. But what's interesting is, just like we challenge this idea of the virtue of just faith as the word sounds, belief, and what that means just in regard to the surface of the word and not the biblical context. It's more than just believing a fact. It's more than just believing that Jesus is the Son of God. You can be very sincere, and that based in a fullness of evidence that we would ourselves appeal to, and it still not be the faith that Jesus wants. He challenges that, and as soon as he does, then it turns 360. It's just or 180, I should say. Complete turnaround. And it's like in a split second. They believed in him, and now they're calling him a Samaritan that has a demon. And it's really interesting how the human heart can work. And it all boils down to, do they truly want truth? Do they truly want a relationship with God? Kurt?
Well, don't really deal with it here in the Gospels, but there's another thing that testifies to his authenticity by the Father, and that is for those who are unskilled and untrained, the miracles are right there in their face. Mm-hmm. For those who are trained, who can read and study and know the law, if they believe that the law is from God, then the fulfillment of the prophecies in the law should have convicted them that he is who he said he is. Yeah. Yes, it's true that some of the prophecies had to do with healing the blind and the lame and all of that, but there are so many other prophecies from the law of Moses that Jesus fulfilled that are not really discussed here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so, I mean, you can understand their bias when they claimed that no prophet has ever come out of Galilee. Well, they know better than that. They know that's not true. And it shows they're just being manipulative. They're being dishonest. They're taking advantage of people that might not know any better. And that's true. That's one of the most, if not the most powerful witnesses to his claims, is that he's fulfilling prophecy that was spoken hundreds, thousands of years ago. And you can go back to those books and check it, and it always comes true, just as it says it will. And those people should have known it more than anyone. That's a great point. All right. If someone doesn't mind, let's read verses 31 through 36.
Then Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants, and have never been in bondage to anyone. How can you say you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, Most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. And a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed.
Thank you. All right, so Jesus, just like in John 6, he's not trying to make it too difficult for them. He's not trying to scare them away. And we should be wary of ever saying something like that. You're just trying to make it too hard. Well, that's kind of reading a heart at the start. You know, you can't assign that to me. That's not my motive, to make it too hard for someone. Jesus isn't either. Really what he's wanting is true faith. He's wanting not just, oh yeah, he might be legit, and then I'm going to just go my own way and leave him alone because of it. He wants commitment. He wants discipleship. And so he's not trying to scare them away, but ultimately they do go away very frustrated and actually try to kill him because they don't actually love the truth. We should never be afraid of giving people the truth and showing them what the commitment is and showing them the difficulties of it, having them count the cost. Because we're not trying to just attract anyone. We're trying to attract people of God. We're trying to attract people to Christ and make children of God. So I think the first word that really jumps out at us in verse 31 that elevates this idea of verse 30 that many believed in him is disciple. What is a disciple? And how might that elevate the concept of belief? A follower of Christ. So a follower, not just one who learns. And so that would suggest following in a couple of different senses. I'm following in regard to sitting at his feet and hearing him and learning from him and coming to a conclusion based on what he's teaching, and then I'm following his teaching. Disciple was not just a pupil, Vine says in his dictionary, but an adherent. They are spoken of as imitators of their teachers. So go back to chapter 6 and remember that he's talking about being the bread of life, consuming him, and we have a phrase, you are what you eat, and that's kind of what Jesus was saying. You need to consume me. Take my teachings and my life as your own. Live them out. Follow me. Walk in my steps. Imitate me. Be in fellowship with God. And that's what he's saying here. If you abide in my word, though, is the method to that particular call of discipleship. Abiding in my word. And that word abide is something he'll use in chapter 14 when he talks to the disciples. It's a word that helps us to recall thoughts of fellowship. It's a relationship word. It was used in regard to residence, abiding in a home, and then the noun for the abode of one's dwelling. But Jesus used it in a relational sense. In fact, he'd say, using a similar word in John 14, that me and my Father will come and make our home with him. And he's not saying that they'll live inside our flesh and bones, but there is an intimate relationship. And you can remember times when Jesus says, I am in my Father and my Father in me. That sounds like a contradiction, but it's just showing us the intimacy of that fellowship. They think the same. They do the same. They speak the same. They teach the same. Their will is the same. And that's what Jesus has in mind for us. If you abide, though, in my word, it's his teaching that he wants us to have fellowship with him through. He would say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so that knowing the truth is escalated as well. It's not just intellectual. It is with experience and activity and engagement. Knowing the truth is knowing it in the sense of participating in it. And what is that going to do for them? Which is the whole point of Jesus' ministry. What's it going to do for them? It'll set them free. Now, back in verse 12, that's the whole point. I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. If you're in the darkness, which is what chapter 3 talked about as well at the very beginning of his ministry, then you're separated from God. You're dead spiritually. You're a slave of sin. But when you come to the truth, you obey the truth, you follow the truth, you're walking in the light, you're freed from darkness, you're freed from sin. That's been his whole point. It's not to restore Israel to their grandeur and physical senses. It's not to conquer the Romans, which is all the kinds of thoughts that would be in a Jew's mind at this time. And when they came out to meet John, that's their thoughts, is this is the beginning of that wonderful time. And it is, but it's not what you thought it was. Do you really want the truth? That's the question. It might not be what you thought it was. The disciples have been learning this. They've stuck with Jesus. Remember when many went away in chapter 6? What did Peter say to Jesus? Where shall we go? You have what?
Words of life.
The words of life. Not physical, but spiritual. And there's still a lot of catching up he had to do. They're not there yet. But they are not rejecting him because things are different than what they thought it was. And Nathanael is kind of the poster child for who they actually are in comparison to the rest of the world. Israelites indeed, in whom is no deceit. They really love God. They really want to be his children in the fullest sense. And so he's telling them, you're not. You need to be free. And what's their mindset when he says that? Physical. Again, physical. And they're lying to themselves too. We've never been in bondage to anyone. Maybe they're thinking about how, because they're Abraham's, descendants, that they're free in regard to the being subjects of the promise, so it's all going to work out in the end. But they're just lying to themselves. I mean, the Old Testament is riddled with their history from Judges all the way through to Malachi, the fact that they have been in and out of bondage throughout their history. It started in bondage, and God had to free them. That's the story of redemption. You're in slavery, God needs to free you. And it's no different at this time. They're actually in Roman bondage. The thing is, though, they're to be relieved and freed from a spiritual bondage. So, what bondage are they in? Sin. Whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Under the law, you can't actually get rid of that. And Hebrews 10 talks about how if they just thought for a second about the recurring Day of Atonement and all these sacrifices, then they could have reached the conclusion that this means it doesn't work. We've got to have a sacrifice that actually works, and you do it once and that's it. We don't need any more. You're a slave of sin. But remember, they said they're Abraham's descendants, and notice what he says in verse 35 and 36. A slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. And the idea is so that you can be a true son and be in the house forever. What house would he be talking about? Why would he bring that up? It's not just this kind of side point, this is how slavery works. Obviously not a physical structure. Today, the house of God is the church. What would they think of God's house, of the house? Israel, God's family, his people. But even under the Old Testament, they are not all Israel who are of Israel. You've got to be inwardly circumcised in the heart. And so what he's saying is that because you are a slave to sin, you may be in the house in the sense that you're an Israelite, you're the physical nation of God. That only counts for so much, and that's a limited time. The nation's going to be destroyed. God's not going to abide with them forever because they've rejected him so many times. And that's a part of prophecy too that Jesus is drawing on. But if you're freed from sin, you can become a true child of God and never be taken away from him. And that's his point. That only works if you're thinking spiritually. Doesn't work if you're thinking physically. Because then you'll be thinking like Nicodemus, do I have to be born again? I'm already a Jew. How does that work? But certainly Jesus is trying to get them to realize something more significant. Steve?
It seems that in all this, that there's this great sense of arrogance and a lack of humility. That's Alcoholics Anonymous. The first thing they have to do is, say, I'm John Doe and I'm an alcoholic. It's almost, I'm Steve Cook and I'm a sinner. You need to admit where your weakness is and has been and repent and turn from it. And that's, bringing it home. We have to be careful that, I'm a member of the church, so therefore, there's can be a sense of arrogance. We just got to be sure that we always keep that humility, that we can be wrong in certain things and always be seeking and searching.
Yeah, that's a great point. Constant self-examination to test whether you're in the faith. And that's what they should have been doing. And it's like I said, it could happen the same way in the church, ironically, even though according to prophecy, the whole design was that it wouldn't be that way anymore. But there will always be hard-hearted men who have their mind only set on things below. And that makes things messy. And so just because you're a member at 84th Street and faithful as far as everyone else knows, if you're a slave of sin, you need to be made free. You're not a true son. You're not a true daughter. And I realize the sense that, people even that are withdrawn from you, admonish them as a brother. There's that sense. But you're Satan's servant at that time until that sin is forgiven and you commit your life back to Jesus. And that takes extreme honesty and humility. Good point. All right. So he challenges their idea of belief, calls them to discipleship, tries to get them to realize in humility their sin and what following Jesus actually looks like and what it's for. It's not just to be right. It's not just to, avoid the, guilty look of killing a prophet of God. It's to be freed from sin. He brings salvation with him. But now they're hung up on this idea of that identity. What do they really want to be identified as? Well, the right answer would be a true child of God. What they stop at is being content with being and thinking that the greatest is being a physical child of God, which there is no such thing, by the way. He chose the physical nation of Israel, but as John the Baptizer said, God can raise up children to Abraham from these stones. It was never about anything inherent within their flesh. He chose them randomly as far as they were concerned. He had a plan, but there was nothing special about them. What made them special is God sanctifying them. So what do you really want to be? They want to be Abraham's descendants. Well, that's good if what you mean is spiritually Abraham's descendants. And Jesus is going to point that out as well. And things, understandably so, continue to escalate. So he says in verse 37, I know that you're Abraham's descendants. And I think here he's trying to get them, and you can imagine his tone too. I mean, we don't know what it was, but you can imagine Jesus isn't getting worked up and about to fly off the handle yelling or anything. Listen, I know you're Abraham's descendants. Don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing with a very obvious, unarguable fact. That would be ridiculous of me to dispute that. Yes, you're Jews, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. Well, what does that mean? I speak what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have seen with your father. Pause right there. Not disputing physically. That's a given. That's obvious. We're all Abraham's descendants physically. My challenge is, are you a true child of God? Do you really want to be a child of God? And he goes back to the same test he's been administering through his whole ministry after there were witnesses to confirm his claims as being one sent of God, one who's come down from heaven, the child of God, the Son of God. You seek to kill me. And the reason is because my word has no place in you. And always remember, connect that with the word of the Father. If you really will to do his will, you'll know that my will is his will. But my word has no place in you, which means who else's word doesn't have any place in them? The Father's. The Father's. If that's not the case, there's got to be something they can identify that Jesus has taught wrong, but they can't do that. And he says, my word has no place in you. The American Standard Version says, because my word hath not free course in you. And that's the idea. That's what the word means. And so it really comes with a predisposition, deciding beforehand that if it's the truth, I'm going to let it have its way with me. We sing that song. But they were biased. They had ulterior motives. So when the truth actually hit them, their hearts were closed up. The truth couldn't penetrate. My word does not have free course in you. And it's because my Father's not your Father. And he's going to show them what that actually means, which will make them furious. But my Father's not your Father. If you actually were a child of God, an Israelite indeed, like Nathaniel, if you really wanted to be a part of God's spiritual household, then you would be accepting of my word. I know, though, that we don't have the same Father because of your desire to kill me. Anything on that? Who do they say is their father? Abraham. You remember what Paul said about Abraham being the father in Romans 4? In what way is he a father? To all who believe. Him being a father was never meant to be emphasized, certainly not limited to the physical. Would he be a father of a nation? Certainly. But what was the promise? The father of many nations. His fatherhood, his being that father figure, so to speak, is spiritual. And so even in the Old Testament, but especially as it's fulfilled and explained in the New Testament, and you could put this side by side with Romans chapter 4 and get a lot out of it, it was always about Abraham's faith, his fidelity to God, his faithful obedience, his sacrificial way of living. Hebrews 11 explains it. you are a child of Abraham if you're like that. Not just because you can trace your lineage back under the genealogy. So he explains, if you were Abraham's children, not you would be able to prove it by the genealogies. If you're Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. Who would have thought such a thing? Well, they were thinking physically. It's not about what I do that confirms who I am, but it's what I am physically. But you would do the works of Abraham, which are works of faith. But now you seek to kill me, verse 40, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. And he says, Abraham did not do this. You did the deeds of your father. Abraham did what when God spoke to him? He obeyed. Think about this. What was Abraham before God called him out? What was Abraham's father? An idolater. And you read that in Joshua 24. Terah, Abraham's father, he served the gods on the other side of the river or served the Lord. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So, I mean, think about that. Abraham's listening to these prophets of idols and all these kinds of things. He's being raised in this. And then God, without a dispute, we don't know exactly how it happened or whatever, but we know he called him out of Ur of the Chaldees to follow him and then made that promise. He was justified by faith. He had the scripture fulfilled, Romans 15:6, but it started all the way back there. He moved by faith, and he was righteous by faith. And he got those promises because of that. He obeyed him, but that in contrast to these other prophets, this other doctrine, these other words. Now these Jews, they're following what they think is the truth, and Jesus is contradicting it, the traditions, that is not actually the truth, and they're wanting to kill him. When has Abraham ever killed someone because they're speaking the truth? You must not be Abraham's descendants, but you are doing the deeds of your father. And it's kind of like they see the challenge of elevating this. Oh, we're not born of fornication. We have one father. And they don't say Abraham now. They say God. You know what? You're right. Let's think spiritually here. God chose us. He called Israel his son, his firstborn. So we're born of God. And so he meets that. In verse 42, let's read verse 42 through 43. Someone read that, please.
Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God. Nor have I come of myself, but he who sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word.
Thank you. So the question might be, why are you the test of whether we have fellowship with God? Why are you the test? You say, I'm not God's son. God is not my father because I've rejected you. Well, based on what does that, is that the right test? Is that the standard? Well, he says, I have not come of myself, but he sent me. Now, what has he shown? What has he done to show that that's true? And they're not disputing it either. They're just not being consistent. I mean, the whole purpose of John's gospel, what he records, the miracles. Yes, the fulfilled prophecy, the authority with which he taught inherently, but the miracles. There's no way around that. That's why miracles are so important. And why once they happen and confirm someone or confirm a message, you don't need to have them again because they're that powerful. That won't change. God is directly through miracles showing that he is sent from him. And you don't like what he's saying, you're kind of still wondering why it's this way when I always thought it was that way. All of that should be put aside if you really want to be God's child, because there's no disputing with miracles. And at some point they would say, you do it by Satan himself, and he would show the folly in that. That's illogical. That doesn't actually work. That's not a test that will pass. And so you see it, what are you going to do with it? Well, they have rejected him and want to kill him. If they actually love God, they would be accepting of him. Then he says something interesting. He says, why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. when people don't love the truth and they're resisting it, they will get hung up on some of the most simple things. For example, in the same chapter, they said, "Where is your Father?" And he says, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also." He had said in verse 18, "The Father who sent me bears witness of me." And then notice, you get up to verse 26, and he says, "He who sent me is true." And it says, they did not understand that he spoke them of the Father. They're not understanding his speech. They can't even make sense of the very simple connections he's making. And he says the reason you can't understand that is because the message that ultimately lies behind the speech, the whole point of what I'm saying, that you're in sin, that you need salvation, that you need my forgiveness, that you need my truth to rescue you from sin, you reject that. You're not able to make sense of anything I'm saying because you've rejected the very core and principle of what I'm saying. And I think that's what happens when we talk to others in the world. They reject the idea that we have to do anything to be saved. And so they can't understand simple things like repent and be baptized for the remission of sins. We wonder why that happens. They can't understand what those words mean because they've rejected the message that they confirm. You've got to have an honest and pliable heart. And so what they are is of the father, the devil. That's their father. How do we make the connection here? They're not Satanists. They're not, walking around worshiping Satan. They wouldn't, subscribe to that idea. But he was a murderer, does not stand in the truth. There's no truth in him, verse 44. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources because he's a liar and the father of it. So he is totally opposed to truth, uses the opposite of truth to kill people who actually want to follow the truth. He deceives them. And so it's not that they would ever identify themselves with Satan. They would never align themselves with Satan. And it's not that they're insincere in the sense that they want to be identified with God in some sense, though it may be shallow. And I think the same thing happens today. It's not that the people we talk to don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. It's not that they don't want something to do with religion and Christianity as they understand it, but it doesn't make them any less a child of Satan than these men when they're rejecting the truth, when they love a lie over the truth, when they reject Jesus in the form of rejecting the truth that he reveals. And like Hebrews 6 says, they crucify for themselves afresh the Son of God when they turn back to the world even with Christians. And so, a lot of times I think, at least speaking for myself, it's hard to digest that idea that anyone would identify themselves with Satan, and it's because they wouldn't. Their actions do. They just don't want to admit it, because that's certainly nothing anyone would ever want to align themselves with. But the proof is in the pudding. It's a matter of our actions, not just our claims. And so he says, because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Not despite telling the truth, you don't believe in me, but the very reason you don't believe in me is because I tell the truth. They see that it's true, and that's why they reject it. And that's very telling. So then he questions, which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why don't you believe in me? He who is of God hears God's words, therefore you do not hear because you are not of God. So, first of all, are my claims true or false? And if you say they're false, show me. They can't do it. And then he wraps it all up in just very plain words. The reason you're not God's is because you don't listen to my words. It's that simple. So how do they react in verse 48? What do they call him? Samaritan with the devil, the demon. There's no substance to that. We see that all the time. Let's not confront the truth and instead call you names. It's interesting they call him a Samaritan because he just got done telling them, you're not a child of God even though you're a Jew. Samaritans aren't God's children either. And I think that's what they're saying. And you're sounding crazy. But he says, listen, no, I don't have a demon. He doesn't even address the Samaritan claim. He says, I honor my Father and you dishonor me. But before they think that, whoa, he's in this for himself, he always makes sure to say, I don't seek my glory, but God does. There's one who seeks and judges. It's God who said in chapter 5, well, Jesus, alluding to what God's will was, that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. That was God's plan. That's not me. That's God. That's His decision. And I'm just submitting to His will. And He's going to judge you for not honoring me. If anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death. That's powerful to me. That despite all that's happened up to this point, even in this very context of chapter 8, and how resistant they are to the truth, how they're actively seeking to kill him and ignoring the obvious truth right in front of them, he's still trying to get them to see it so they can live. Listen to me. I want you to live. Listen to my words. I want you to be with God forever. And of course, this angers them even more, because if he claims to have the power to give life where they'll never see death, then he must have it himself, which is what chapter 5 said as well. That he has life in himself, and so he has been given authority to grant it to others. They understood that much. You're thinking you're greater than Abraham? He's dead. He couldn't say that of himself. So you must be thinking you're better than Abraham. And he backs up on that same point. I'm not honoring myself. It's my Father who honors me. You say that he's your God. Verse 55. Yet you have not known him, but I know him. And if I say I do not know him, I shall be a liar like you, but I do know him and keep his word. So listen, I'm not honoring myself. All of this is coming from God. He's performing the miracles through me as well, and you see that. If you really love God, then you'd honor me as well. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to stoop to this because of your pressure, and we shouldn't either. Someone calls us arrogant because we won't shake. We're standing our ground. It's wrong for us to say, well, maybe I'm wrong. Not when you stand on a verified truth. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. This is where they call out his age, and you say you've seen Abraham, and Jesus makes this statement from Exodus 3, I am. And he had made it already before a couple of times, just not as emphatically. There's no missing it here. He's claiming to be eternal God. I am. A state of constant existence. There's never a time where he wasn't. There's never a time where he will not be. There's just I am. And that's what Jesus is claiming. Eternal God. They tried to stone him. And, he skirts them. In chapter 9, that's where it picks up, because it says, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. And as Jesus passed by, he sees a man who is blind from birth. And so really fast-paced at this point, and it's only going to escalate until they get what they want and kill him. Thank you for your attention. John 9 on Sunday, Lord willing.